professional and personal opinion and do not necessarily represent my institution. Also, one more thing I need to point out is that I am Chinese, I'm Asian, and I've studied history and religion for the past 15 years. But despite my academic qualifications, I do not claim to represent, nor will I fully acknowledge and know the experience of Black people in America. So I think that's something very, very important to get it out of the way first. And this talk is not particularly a full description of Black history in America. So what I'm going to do is basically just give you a little rundown about the Black experience in the United States. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, we can begin. So people always ask this question: is racism still prevalent in the U.S.? I mean, after all, slavery ended in 1865, right? With Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, the end of the Civil War. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 with Martin Luther King Jr. He even has a public holiday that's celebrated every year in January. And Barack Obama is the president 2008 to 2016. So what's the deal? And oh, even Oprah is around and she's a billionaire. So with all this, is racism still prevalent in the United States? Now, if you look at some of the data that's taken out by Pew Research, you would see a survey done among Black and whites, white Americans, about why Blacks have a harder time getting ahead than whites. And it's very telling from this chart that only 36% of white people, compared to 70% of Blacks, say that racial discrimination is the major reason why Black and white may be struggling to get ahead. So why is there this disparity in thinking? It's something that's, I suppose, it's sort of an interesting caveat, right? That whites don't think. It seems that the data seems to suggest that white people don't seem to think that racism is a problem, or at least 36% of them say that. Well, it's something else, right? If Black people are not getting ahead, then it's something else rather than racism. So what I'd like to do is actually discuss a little bit about the way history is taught in America. And for the most part, history is something like this, right? In American history, Columbus lands in the New World, founded America. The Pilgrims and the Puritans landed in Massachusetts Bay. They fled oppression in Europe. They fled hardship in Europe, and they landed in Massachusetts and America, and they established themselves who they are. Then they declared independence from an oppressive British force, with George Washington being the first president. They expanded the country to the west, okay, seeking new life and seeking new opportunities, okay. And then somewhere down the line, in the 1860s, there was a civil war between the North and the South, to which many people would argue that the North won and freed the slaves. Before most people know about World War I, of course, everybody knows about World War II. Then there's the famous "I Have a Dream" speech that many people know, that Martin Luther King gave, which then led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. There's the Vietnam War, and of course 9/11, which sort of changed the American landscape until today, right? We're still feeling the repercussion. And finally, people would say that, oh, look, Barack Obama becomes president in 2008, right? Before now Donald Trump. But this is sort of like the trajectory that Americans, for the most part, history tells us, tells Americans, right? So, but it's sort of a very nostalgic feeling of American history, in a sense that this is the story of a bunch of people who fled Europe with nothing, with hope, but hopes and dreams. They came to a country that's really wild, that's really, really difficult, but they build it out of nothing, and it become what it is today, seemingly the greatest country in the world. So we will call this a very sort of a triumphant history of America, or some people will actually say a very sanitized history of America. Reggie Gibson, who is a school teacher, basically said that our problem as Americans is we actually hate history. what we love is nostalgia. And I think that sort of hit home, right? Because the consequence of this nostalgia is the sidelining of the experience and agency of African Americans and other minorities in America. So, as you can see, just what I just briefly covered, that that's the idea of a triumphant American history doesn't have a lot of room for uncomfortable history. And sometimes we cannot see how the events of Black Lives Matter and the killing of Black people today is related to how Americans view their story. Okay, I think somebody's mic is on, but it's okay. Um, so avoiding uncomfortable history means that Americans cannot see that how the present connects to the past. So at the gist of this talk is basically saying that Americans don't particularly understand how things connect, how the present is connected to the past, especially on the things that are sort of like glossed over a little bit. So what I'm gonna go on now saying is just touch on a little bit about the brief history of the Black experience in the United States. Because unfortunately we have to start with the experience of slavery. Uh, I put here 1619, where the first African slaves came to the New World, but it actually started in 1492 when Christopher Columbus landed in the New World. Uh, Although back then it wasn't African slaves, it was Native American slaves. So even the way we frame slavery sort of has this very, uh, something. People always say it happened in the past. We don't do that anymore, and it's mainly a sudden problem. But it's not particularly a sudden problem in the sense that slavery was actually the cornerstone of it's an institution that influenced a lot of things in the United States, from its major political and social institutions, as well as its economy for much of the 19th century. Uh, when America was declared independent, they had an issue with slaves in the South in matters of how do you count them, because they were discussing about the Constitution and how many congressmen and senators need to be in the U.S. Congress, and so they were thinking about how do you count slaves? Do you count as full people or not? And what they came out with is that slave was considered 3/5 of a person, right? And in doing so, they sort of increased the electoral votes of the southern states until the Civil War, and this have massive repercussions in the United States because as a working democracy, each state has votes and says. So if you have more representation and more electoral votes in the South, that means the slavery question will always be there. Okay, but just so you know that it's not a sudden issue. Uh, Slaves were of course brought over to the United States to work on plantation, namely cotton, because cotton production was huge in the mid 19th century, where in fact 52% of U.S. exports by 1840 were cotton, and the northern states, who supposedly don't have too much slaves, were actually profiting from this through its factories, manufacturing textile. So in a way, you could see a sort of like a bigger picture that slavery affects. It's not just from the South, right? But like the entire country benefits from this system. Uh, but just so you know, the third president of the United States, uh, viewed blacks in such a way that black people are somehow inferior, uh, that if they are freed, should not be allowed to mix. Okay, because Thomas Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence, but he himself is a slave owner who basically argued that, uh, you know, black people cannot possibly be allowed to uh, be free to roam around and mix in the United States. So at best, right, even if slavery was not good, at best, blacks should be sent back home to Africa, right? Because mixing is just wrong, because it would just sort of mess up the country, so to speak. Okay. Um, you will also see instances where slavery is sort of seen as a benevolent institution. For slave owners in the South, blacks were, of course, seen as inferior. And so they made up the argument that it is better for blacks to become slaves in America because, at the very least, they will be taught civilization. As you can see this picture, right? It's sort of like a propaganda. On the left, uh, all these stereotypes of black people half naked with spears indicate uncivilized, barbaric. And on the right, if they become slaves, you see them sitting down, they're wearing clothes, which symbolizes civilization. So for a lot of people, the way to justify slavery is to say that, hey, actually, it's a good thing that uh, this institution, slavery as an institution, actually uplifts them. But of course, the reality is it's very different, right? Because as slaves, you don't really have any freedom. Your job mainly consists of picking cotton, and if you don't make the quota, this is what happens. Or if you run away, this is what happens to you. And of course, needless to be said, slaves are considered to be property, right? At the minute you buy a slave, you will be branded, just like how we brand cattle and how we brand animals. So, in a sense, yes, even though they think that this is civilized, but in reality, this these pictures sort of like show things that are very, very contrary to this. Okay, so of course, slavery is no longer there in America, right? Thanks to an incident, or a very, very important event that happened in the mid 19th century called the American Civil War. But here's the question, right? What is the cause of the Civil War? And that question has continued to plague a lot of Americans today. A survey done by the Southern Poverty Law Center indicated that only 8% of American high school seniors can identify slavery as a central cause of the Civil War. And depending on who you talk to in the region of the country, Civil War uh, has many, 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 many titles. It ranges from the war to preserve the Union, the war of the Southern Rebellion, the war between the states, or the war of the Northern Aggression. So depending on where you are. So if you're a Southerner, some people might say that this is a war to, or where the North were the aggressors. So why this disparity, right? Why do Americans suffer from this conflicting and fractured history of the Civil War? Uh, this is important, right? Because if you don't get this right, then slavery sort of becomes this sort of moot point. Okay, uh, the reason why there's such a disparity in thinking really comes from this thing called the lost cause narrative. Okay, I'll talk more about it, but for now, the lost cause narrative basically states that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War, it was states' rights. Slavery was a benevolent institution and it was accepted by blacks. Secession was constitutional. The North were the aggressors who overwhelmed the more noble Christian and chivalrous South. And Southern generals were basically very noble and very honorable people, especially the general Robert E. Lee, and they lost out to unprincipled Northern generals like Ulysses S. Grant. So, as you can see, this is the story that was it was a myth, right? It's a myth told uh, by Southern historians as a way to justify why they lost out uh, to Civil War. Okay, uh, in fact, Abraham Lincoln, who's many people would tout to be the person that freed the slaves, didn't really come on board in freeing the slaves until 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. And before that, the sole reason for fighting the Civil War was to preserve the Union. But eventually, the South lost, right? So when the South lost, they were forced to uh, abolish slavery. But it's not particularly an easy thing for them, in the sense that former slave masters now have to basically contend with a bunch of blacks running around the South. So what do you do with these people? Um, and so we talked about Reconstruction, right? Uh, in which slavery was abolished, blacks were afforded equal protection under the law, and they were given the right to vote. But of course, resistance by Southern whites and political intrigue ultimately ended this experiment in 1877. And with the end of Reconstruction in 1877, you get the reassertion of white supremacy in the South and the introduction of Jim Crow segregation laws. Okay, what are Jim Crow segregation laws? It's basically legalized segregation, which basically states black and whites should not be integrated. Okay, and at the same time, the right to vote were sort of like severely curtailed by states government passing laws that are really, really unfair for blacks. For example, they have things like the poll tax and the literacy laws, which basically says that if you can't read, you can't vote, or if you can't pay a certain amount of money, you can't vote. So these are some of the ways that blacks were denied these basic civil rights, even after they were freed from slavery. And those who resist are violently targeted. Okay, and how are they targeted? Lynching. Okay, between 1877 and 1950, nearly 4,000 black men, right, were lynched in the 12 southern states. And the United States tried to pass anti-lynching bills. 7 presidents tried it between 1890 to 1952, but none of them passed laws that ban lynching. Okay. If you don't know what lynching is, it's basically mob justice, right? In Jim Crow South, if a black person is suspected of anything, looking at a white woman wrongly, or maybe even nothing, right? Something happens and somebody says a black person did this, and the whole mob of white people would descend on them and basically kill them. And it sort of becomes a public spectacle, as you can see from this picture. It's apparently, kids and women enjoy these kinds of spectacles, which is, of course, shocking for all of us. But this thing is only about 100 years. And as late as the 1920s and 30s and 40s, people are still getting lynched. And that's because of the sort of unfinished work of the Civil War, or at the very least, I should say, how America sort of gave up on blacks because Reconstruction didn't work, and so they sort of just gave up. Okay, and in giving up Reconstruction, when the Southern whites reasserted their dominance over black people, that's when they created the lost cause narrative, right? Which give the myth that slavery is not the cause of the Civil War. This is a book that was written called the Confederate Catechism, which basically states that no, slavery is not the cause of the Civil War. And this was actually taught in Southern schools. Whereas the history records show that slavery is, yes, the cause of the Civil War. Here is a declaration of secession for the state of Mississippi, which was ratified in January 1861, which states that the reason why they secede is because of slavery. Slavery is a lucrative business for the South and very, very important for the economy. And so for this declaration, basically it says that if you get rid of slavery, it's a blow to the common sense civilization. So either they secede or they give up slaves. And so I guess Mississippi decided that they don't want to give up slaves and they want to secede. So what happens, right, after 1877, right up to the 1950s, and you see a systematic retelling of slavery, retelling of the Civil War, a Southern perspective, which is what we call the lost cause. An introduction of segregation laws, which basically does not allow black and white people to integrate. As you can see here from these two pictures, even water fountain, the water is the same, right? But the fountain is different. There's a water fountain for white and a water fountain for quote unquote colored, i.e. black. Even in cafes, right, there are separate doors for you to enter. This is Jim Crow. Anybody that's caught violating this, their lives will be threatened or jailed or perhaps even death at times. So right at the same time, the South began constructing monuments honoring the Southern heritage. As you can see today, there are still nearly 800 Confederate monuments in the United States, spread over 31 states, including the District of Columbia. And these monuments will be something like this. This is the one on the left is a monument to Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis is the one and only president of the Confederate States. There are monuments honoring the Confederate soldiers. In particular, their most beloved general, Robert E. Lee. Okay, this is Robert E. Lee's tomb, and as you can see, Confederate flags still fly. Confederate flags still fly in the United States, especially in the South. So, interestingly, right, these monuments were built right at the time of the early turn of the 20th century. This is right at the time with the enactment of Jim Crow laws. As if it's sort of like a double tandem thing, right? Once the Southern whites reasserted themselves in the South, they put blacks back into their place. Okay, we can't own them, but they're gonna stay in their place. And in doing so, they also constructed a history which actually argues that no, the South had a very noble cause, which is the lost cause of the Civil War. And so they begin to build monuments to, quote, honor the war generals and the heroes. But, as you can see, that there seems to be some correlation here with the spikes in Confederate monuments, which coincided with all these Jim Crow laws. And also you see this mini spike in the 50s and 60s, which also coincided with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. Sorry, I talk a lot, so I gotta drink a little bit. Please forgive me. So yeah, it is sort of a reassertion, right? As if to say, hey, blacks, stay in your lane. Here are our heroes. Okay, a faction that lost in a war, putting statues of their generals who lost in the war is sort of unheard of in that sense. But they did, and many of the monuments are still around today. And because of this skewed idea, right, that the Civil War was not fought because of slavery, it's something else. It's to protect our states' rights. It's to maintain our honor. And the South merely lost because they were just overwhelmed. But it was a noble struggle because they were honorable people. They were Christians. They did everything right, and still they lost. And so this sort of history really has confused generations of American kids, especially kids in the South. Okay, but the North is not particularly free of this either, right? Because of the way, like I said, American history is taught. Because even if there's segregation in the North, the general idea about black people is that black people or Africans or darker skinned people are not as civilized as Europeans, right? All these ideas about black people, as you can see during slavery, that they're children, that they have no civilization, really sort of gets carried forward in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with this thing called social Darwinism, as well as a pseudoscience called phrenology, which argues that you can determine the intelligence and the characteristic of a group of people by measuring the size of their heads and their skulls. So this is actually a thing, okay? This was taught in universities back then. So the assumption is that European civilization, white civilization, is the best because if they look around them, everything's great. If you look at black people, the reason why they're like this, oh, it's because they don't develop properly. The size of the skull is horrible. Different size of the skull, right? This is true. As if you see, uh, depending on the size of your skull from the left to the right, the black person is only just above uh, monkeys, which is supremely racist, right? And this is how they grade levels intelligence. And so very quickly, this idea of levels intelligence give rise to the idea that uh, certain people were born certain ways and they look certain ways, they are more prone to criminality, right? This is a poster uh, posted by the Eugenics Society in the United States. If you don't know what eugenics is basically a science of determining healthy babies, so to speak. But eugenics also has a racial connotation, which basically argues that certain types of people, if you breed with them, you will produce less than perfect babies, so to speak. And the biggest target are blacks, basically. Black people will dilute the gene pool. Black people will dilute characteristics of white people. So, in a way, right, this sort of scientific way of determining levels of intelligence basically disallowed interracial marriages and basically create an idea that blacks are somehow naturally inferior to whites, right? And so because they're naturally inferior to whites, then they are they shouldn't we shouldn't no we shouldn't hang out with them too much. We should be suspicious of them because they're more prone to being criminals. Okay, so this is just only over 100 years ago. People were thinking about like this. Okay, I know there's a lot, right? So if you allow me a few more minutes, I'll continue. Okay, so remember all these ideas about blacks being criminals, blacks being unable to fend for themselves, blacks are dangerous, all sort of gets translated to social policies. And one of them has to do with housing. This is probably one of the most insidious things that ever happened in the history of the United States. It started in the 1930s uh, during the New Deal era, where the Federal Housing Authority was asked to basically evaluate the value of housing. And they assigned color codes to each neighborhood to basically determine if the property and the value of that land is going up or down. And very quickly, if you see, this is the map of Chicago, okay, you see different colors. Okay, green probably is basically the healthiest, and red is basically the place where it has no value, right? The property has no value, and basically red, the color, indicates the presence of many minorities, especially black people, which seemingly indicates that if there are black people living in your neighborhood, the value of your property and the value of your housing area is going to go down. And so that translates to banking and financing. So if a black person wants to buy a house in, say, I don't know, a part of Chicago, but because that's a green area, and the idea is that if a black person comes to this area, it's going to devalue your property, then blacks are basically not allowed. They're denied loans to buy certain homes because the idea is that uh, if a presence of a black person in a neighborhood just comes into a neighborhood, then the value of the housing just goes down. And so this sort of like has a domino effect, right? Because houses and housing is kind of like your nest egg, right? You the house that you have gives you value, it goes up. You can refinance and you can resell your house and you go up in society. But because black people were denied access to buy certain homes, they basically have to stay in what we call inner cities. And so as white suburban neighborhoods begin to develop, because the value of property is high, so more and more businesses would go there, better schools, better jobs, better services. Whereas black, predominantly minority and black neighborhoods, the value goes down. No business want to go there. Uh, schools will not get the proper funding, and so now you see how the disparity happens, right? This is not just in the South, okay? We're talking about here. This is Chicago, okay, and it happens in northern cities, which really causes disparity between black and whites. Okay. The legacy of housing segregation is that economic inequalities between black and whites remain very substantial. And as in 2013, the net worth of white households is 13 times greater than African American households. These are the legacies of racism. Now, anyway, okay. So this is not particularly taught a lot in schools, right? That the idea that systems in place uh, privileges one group over another. Okay. Well, now most Americans love Martin Luther King. He has a holiday, right? Named after him. Even as recent as the death of with the Black Lives Matter movements, there has been memes being posted and says that, oh, uh, why can't these people be like Martin Luther King? He's such a nice guy. He's a peace-loving integrationist. And what basically happened is that many Americans have a very, very limited understanding of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, yes, he is a nonviolent activist. Yes, he is a Christian, but he's also not just a guy who said, everybody should be together. I have a dream. Okay, he's more than that. He's actually a radical anti-racist and an anti-poverty activist. Okay, and actually look at some of his writings. Uh, though he does not condone rioting, he also understands why people riot, right? And he's written countless things about how uh, racism is poverty is related to racism, and now the Vietnam War is also related to racism because poor people goes off to Asia to fight, right? So I always thought this phrase is it's nice to capture who he is, right? That uh, he basically is trying to understand why people riot. Okay, it's not but because people are just messing things up, right? What he actually says that rioting is the language of the unheard, and the onus is for us to understand why instead of condemning, right? Of course, he again I have to say he does not condone rioting, but Martin Luther King also argues that you got to understand why they're doing this thing instead of just dismissing them. So these are some of the things that we don't really hear about Martin Luther King. We just know he said, "I have a dream." Civil Rights Act passed. Everybody's equal. No more segregation. All good, right? But that's not the issue because he actually continued to link poverty with racism, and you will see future leaders taking up this mantle, especially by Black Panther, Black Power movements that came after Martin Luther King, especially by this guy named Stokely Carmichael, uh, who's, if you've seen the movie, uh, what is that movie? I forgot. American Klansman, I think. He was in that movie. That was the character. The character was there in the movie.
Black Klansman.
Yeah, Black Klansman. There you go. It's a great movie. You should watch it. But he said it very very aptly that the struggle against racism uh, is not just it's not just a sudden issue. That's what Carmichael is saying, right? Most people think that, oh, because there's segregation in the South, black people were lynched, and then we have the Civil Rights Act. Everything's good. So why are you complaining? But you see people like King and now Stokely Carmichael arguing that to say that you know uh, the, the issue of black Americans is they're poor and that they're black and they're related. So any program that addresses racism is not just, we're gonna get rid of segregation, but is to address why poor black people are poor, right? So, well, he's a very fiery guy, right, Carmichael, who basically says that, you know what, we're tired of getting beat up, right? It's time to reclaim who we are, that we are proud people. Uh, so yeah, we should begin with the basic fact that black Americans have two problems. They are poor, they are black. All other problems arise from this two-sided reality, lack of education and the so-called apathy of black men. Any program to end racism must address these. So this is very, very important. But like I said, most people sort of dismiss Carmichael as sort of a radical, uh, sort of a radical person, maybe a leftist or an anarchist or something like that. But what he said is actually interesting and important, right? Because he's, like I said, he's linking them together. So as you see, as we reached the 70s and 80s, as the Nixon and Reagan presidencies upped the ante on the war on drugs, which is a good thing, by the way, but also it produced profoundly unequal outcomes for communities of colors, right? As you can see from this data, black people get incarcerated more than white people, and the use of drugs, including marijuana, is actually equal between blacks and whites. So why are blacks being arrested more? You know, so 3.73 times more actually likely to be arrested. And you can see likelihood of imprisonment between white men and black men. Okay, a white guy would get imprisoned. 1 in 17 black men, a white man will get imprisoned more. 1 in 3 black men will get imprisoned even more. If you look at white women, 1 in 11, and black women, 1 in 18. So it really shows the disparity of that's going on here. So why is this the case? So if you look back at history, you can already see, right? These things didn't go away. Right? It continues to manifest itself. And now look, if you look at the rate of police killings of black people, right? Blacks made up of 12% of the U.S. population, but they account for 26.4 of those that were killed by police under all circumstances. In other words, blacks were the victim of lethal use by force by police at nearly twice their rate in the general population. And that is why Black Lives Matter happened. The idea that black people are somehow dangerous, the idea that black people are somehow uh, not able to get it together, right, leads to this death. And this is just basically a small caveat of people who were killed. Okay, not necessarily by white police, but they were killed. And if you look at, and I've sort of like compiled some of the defense that the reason why they were killed. Of course, the most famous, the one that started the whole Black Lives Matter movement is Trayvon Martin, who was killed by George Zimmerman. And basically, they asked him, "What you doing it? Why did you why did you kill him?" And he says, and he noticed that he was just walking casually, not like he was trying to get out of the rain. Something was off. The idea that black people are suspicious, right? Uh, Here's another example. Philando Castile died in 2016. He had routine stop. The guy said I had a gun with me. The cop panicked and fired him and killed him. Right. So this idea of I was fearing for my life becomes a very, very sort of like a defense that of them, many of the police actually brings up. I fear for my life, so I had to shoot him. So where does this fear come from, right? Again, don't acknowledge the history of this, then you will always fear black people. So that is why the Black Lives Matter movement begins to come up, right? It started off as the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, which then evolves to become more than just a protest movement, actually, against police brutality, but they want policy change. They want legislative change to end the oppression of black people, right? Directing the conversation to how race does matter in both criminal justice and society, which they are, in a sense, a descendant of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So now, some of you are wondering, well, of course, you know, these policies are race neutral. Yes, of course, even though they are created, right, to be not racially biased. But these things carry unconsciousness bias against people, black people, and as you can see from the data. And these biases are carried over from history, and they have hurt black people because they're not fully confronted and discussed. You know, uh, and interestingly, 100 years ago, a sociologist by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois basically already said, black people live a double consciousness life, whereas they cannot define themselves fully. They have to be defined. And so black people live double lives, so to speak, because they cannot be represented. They are always represented through the eyes of others. And that's where you see these problems happening. So I'm going to end this very soon. So what is to be done, right? Basically, the first thing that needs to be done is to admit there's a problem. That's in the relationship between black people, right? Americans have to listen, empathize, and understand black voices. They have to study the contributions and struggles of black people. And they have to change the historical narrative by incorporating black voices to see the overall history of America. Not just something that was done in the past. That things doesn't think that things don't things that happen now is not race related. Okay. Things may look neutral, but they have these uh, racial connotations that's always going to be there in the background. So the first, yeah, these are some of my takeaways from this. So I've talked a lot, um, and I thank you for staying with me for this 15 minutes. I know there's a lot to take in, so thank you for your patience. So I'll take any questions anyone may have. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Kit. That was certainly very, very interesting. I think I learned a lot from your discourse, what you've shared. We are going
Thank
to
you.
take questions now, and Karina, my colleague, will help me. Karina, you have a question for Kit, please.
Yeah, so I'm reading. First off, thank you so much, Dr. Kit.
You're welcome.
So I am gonna read out the questions from the chat box. This one is from Matthew. As you said about nostalgic history, can it be prevalent in other countries, or is it just a phenomenon in America?
Oh, what's Matthew?
Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Matthew. Um, I think for this particular talk, we're just sort of like concentrating on the American context for now. So I didn't really answer your question, but sort of like this is sort of like the American context. So perhaps one could look at other histories, but this is sort of mainly an American phenomenon for now. So the thing I think America sort of has this idea that I mean, Americans like to say that we're the greatest country in the world. We we are so and so. So we can't. So anything that sort of like messes with that narrative is sort of either sidestepped or like ignored. So this is sort of like an American thing. This we're great. We're from nothing. We're great. I hope that answers your question.
All
Okay,
right.
Kit,
Wait.
wait. Kit, could you unshare your slides so your
Oh,
camera?
okay. Sorry.
Okay, Karina, can read out the next question, please.
Okay. So next one, Dr. Lim, where are Native Americans in this narrative of the history of Americas, please? This is from Adrian Lord. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for your question. Okay. So if we look at the same trajectory, right? Uh, Americans came to a country with nothing, built this up into something. Then necessarily Native Americans are also in the picture. But uh, the narrative is even more tragic in the sense that most American history books will acknowledge, yes, they're Indians. We did really bad things to them, and that's it, right? And it's not particularly addressed a lot these days. Addressed just like little caveats, right? There's maybe Thanksgiving. There's the Tecumseh Rebellion. There's the Sioux Wars in the late 19th century. Uh, Wounded Knee, reservations, and then maybe in the 70s you have Wounded Knee too. But for the most part, American narrative about Native Americans are silent because the idea is that, well, they're no longer relevant, so to speak. Or at worst, some people might say that, oh, you know what, they have casinos now, so who cares? So the story of Native Americans is actually more tragic uh, compared to blacks.
Okay, one more from Karina,
Okay. The next
from
one,
Dr. Andy Hickson.
yeah. So Malcolm X said that 100 million blacks were murdered in the American slave trade and called this the Black Holocaust, while others have suggested the figure is closer to 250 million. By murdered, they mean killed by white people. What are your thoughts on this?
Uh, Thanks, Andy, for your question. I think when X talks about this, I think he's basically talking mainly about the institution of slavery, and not just slavery, right, but also the ways where their lives were robbed by discriminatory practices. So it's not just being killed, being shot at, but also the idea that they're not allowed to have the basic human rights, they're not allowed to have the basic civil rights, which in turn basically disenfranchise them, disprivilege them, which then uh, cause their lives to be miserable, which in a way is killing them. And I think that's what X is saying. So it's not just the act of murder, but it's the entire system of this sort of oppressing blacks, basically, in America.
Um, uh, Leading from that question, I have a question for you, Kit.
Sure.
What role do you think the church played in the early days of sanctioning slavery in the United States?
So we're talking about the 15th, 16th, and 17th and 18th centuries.
Correct.
Okay.
Even up, probably up to the early part of the, 19th century, even,
Okay.
because they seem to go along with it and saying that it was justified according to the Bible.
Yeah. When the Spanish first came to the New World, uh, they had a debate whether Native Americans have a soul, and they debated and debated and debated and debated, and they basically concluded that they have half a soul, and because they have half a soul, then we can sort of like treat them with impunity. Uh, and so much I think of Christianity and the church of this time is sort of very Eurocentric, right? So Christianity, if you have to look at it, is not free from its biases and its context. So when Europeans came to the New World, they brought with them a version of Christianity. Right? And the idea is They're like Moses, right? They go into the promised land. So once they reach the promised land, and there are these people there, according to the Bible, that they're just sort of like in the way, right, so to speak, and that the church, especially in the South, in terms of slavery, sanctioned it because the idea is that they take texts from Ephesians that says slaves obey your master, uh, and Christianity actually is synonymous with civilization. So bringing slaves into America is a good thing because we can introduce them Christianity. And since you're slaves, you're supposed to obey. You're supposed to be obedient. So this is the role that the church has played for much of the 19th century. But I should also argue that not all churches uh, believe in that, and that's why you see, Protestant churches especially have so many denominations. For example, the Baptist Church in America, you have the Southern Baptist, you have the North American Baptist. The Presbyterian Church, you have the Presbyterian Church of the United States and the Presbyterian Church of America. Why so many? It's because they split on the issue of slavery. The Southern Baptists basically say no, slavery is God given, right? In fact, many of the segregationists and many of the people who seceded from the United States at the onset of the Civil War basically argued that this is God's hierarchy, right? And that if you free slavery, you're basically going against God. So the church is definitely complicit in this, yes. But religion is a very complicated thing. They are simultaneously life-giving and they're simultaneously life-taking. And so you see the issue of slavery and blacks in America. You see this confluence of it. Some churches say slavery is legal, segregation is legal, and some people say no. I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, Kit.
Thank you.
Karina, there's another question by Faisal.
Hang on. Let me scroll up. Do you see the question?
No?
Yeah, okay. Let me ask the question.
Okay.
Cracks in American society appeared over slavery and other issues in the 1840s that foreshadowed the outbreak of the Civil War. Do you see that the social polarization of today within American society leading to similar upheavals? I think Faisal might be asking, are we going to see another civil war in America?
Hmm. That is a very, very interesting question. I think no, in my professional experience, professional opinion. That's because of the development of American politics in the 21st century compared to the 19th century. In the 19th century, America's Americans don't particularly see themselves as they're more sort of uh, states advocates, so to speak. The idea that if I don't like what the federal government is doing, I can get out, and which is what led to the Civil War, right? Because I can get out of this country. So I think the 21st century they've solved this issue that the federal government is stronger than the state government. You can just leave the country because of this. But I do think that the polarization is there. Uh, no thanks to the current president, sort of like picking on people to do things. But I don't think there will be a civil war in which the country will be split again, because I just think that political developments and social developments of the United States have changed since the 1840s. So that's sort of my uh, opinion.
Okay. Karina, next question, please.
Good question. Thank you.
Okay. This one is from Dr. Hugh. Black and white are two extreme colors, but when some amounts are mixed, it gives gray. When the intensity of black increases, it becomes more gray. That is nature. Do you foresee when the population of black increases, to exceed white population if by end of this century would the white power collapse and another kind of racism would come?
Oh, wow, Dr. Hugh, that's a good question. So basically, if I get you, sorry, I think what you're trying to ask is that if uh, there's racial mixing, then there'll be another new form of racism. I right? I think that's uh, I
Well,
need a few minutes to think about it. Sorry.
actually, to top on that, Adrian actually commented on Dr. Hugh's question. He said, Dr. Hugh, I believe the trend is that the American population is becoming more brown, beige, and yellow, not the binary opposite of white, which is quote unquote black.
True.
Well, can I just add to that?
Sure.
I think maybe it's more clearer to say with massive immigration over the last 20, 30 years into America, people from Asia, people from South and Central America, and some parts of Europe as well have been going into the United States, leading to various states and cities to be less white. Today,
Multicultural. Say.
multicultural, yes, and of course there's this fear of many Americans that they are no longer what they used to be. Now there's a movement to make Washington D.C. a state by itself. Right now it's under the federal government,
Yep.
but because almost two-thirds, almost maybe I would say more than half of Washington D.C. is black, they seem to be unwilling to give statehood to Washington.
Hmm.
This is Washington D.C. because that will add to the electoral college votes for possibly the,
You get three. Yeah.
yeah, you get there, and
Yep.
and now they don't want to do that. So I think that there's this certainly this fear of America not going to be retaining its white status in the future, that possibly might happen.
Maybe not so much white, but the idea of, well, actually it is the idea of whiteness, right, equals uh, Protestant Christianity, nuclear family, patriotic, speaks English, like I said, and I said, a Protestant Christian. So these are ideas that many Americans think is the founding principles of America. And so when you have all these people come in, you will dilute these traditions, which is of course founded on whiteness. These things are not new. Historically, in the late 19th century, when Eastern Europeans, Irish, and Italians and Jews immigrated to America, there was this huge uproar that they're losing their country. We don't want Catholics to come here. Jews are not allowed to be here. So there's always this upheaval, and then it sort of settled down. And then another new group comes in and say, "Oh, we don't want these people." So so it sort of like goes on because they sort of have this idea that America is this this country, and that what makes America exceptional is X, Y, and Z. And if these new people come in, then they're just gonna like mess everything up. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of a little perspective to give.
Thank you, Kit. There's another question from Go Ming. What? Karina, would you be able to read that, please?
Booming. What? Oh, okay. So this one, besides the idea of science, concept of phrenology, levels of intelligence determined by the size or shape of one's head. In your opinion, what could be other potential reasons behind inequality to the blacks in America? In general, how can we as an individual play a role in reducing inequality, racism, or negative labels in a society?
Okay, thank you for your question. Um, of course, those scientific theories are not accepted, obviously, but as I've said earlier, these ideas, maybe it's not scientifically accepted, but this idea that somehow black people are scary, right? Sort of plays out still. Um, so maybe if I can be bold to say a irrational fear of the other sort of fuels inequality. And what do we need to do? We really need to study any history. We really need to objectively look at how minorities are treated in America, and even look at their contributions that made America great, so to speak. That is one way to sort of to not other the minority, if that makes sense. Because if you sort of see them as like these people that are scary and dangerous, then they're sort of outside the narrative. So if you begin to look at the contributions that minorities have done to America, then you could see that they're all in this together, so to speak. And they have rights, and they should have rights, so to speak.
There's one question. This is by your alumni, Aiden Woon. Okay. So Aiden said, people generally say that they are not racist and that because they don't see racism, it doesn't exist. This is where systematic racism comes into place. Stereotypes such and the goon also play a big role in systemic racism. And hence black people are seen as dangerous. The question is, how does one get rid of these stereotypes that propagate negative connotations and individuals and communicates form their own narrative on colored people? Because to change an individual's mind is difficult, especially if said person has strong anecdotes that he or she have experienced.
Hi, Aiden. That's a good question. Long one, but very good from a former student. So the question is, how do you unlearn these things, right? When things are so embedded. Uh, I think the first thing you need to do is the acknowledgement that things are not right. Uh, sorry, could you repeat the question? It's a long question. Sorry.
Hold on, let me go back up. Okay, his question was, how does one get rid of these stereotypes that propagate negative connotations and individuals and communities form their own narrative on colored people? Because to change an individual's mind is difficult, especially if said person has strong anecdotes that he or she experienced.
As cliche as it sounds, conversations, man. Conversations need to happen. Difficult, hard conversations need to happen. Not in a position of saying you're wrong, I'm right, but just sort of say, okay, what is your story? And the other group says, okay, what is your story? And I think looking at different perspectives is one way of addressing this. So the way we approach this conversation is key, I think. Uh, Maybe sometimes it doesn't work, and the force of legislation has to happen, right? I mean, it took a war to end slavery. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be a war, but sometimes legislations do happen. And so I think it's a two tandem thing, right? Individually, hard conversations need to happen, and legislatively, laws need to be put in place to make Black lives matter, so to speak. I hope that answers the
I
question.
thank you, Kid. What I've realized, I think the problem today is that the current president may not be understanding the issue, having grown up with certainly a certain amount of privilege that he has been brought up with. He may not realize how serious the situation is in America today. I just a comment, but I want to inform Miss Adrian that we are restricting the
Mr.
discussion.
Miss Adrian or Mr.?
I'm
Oh,
not sure
Adrian.
I'm not sure it's
Oh,
Adrian
sorry.
or male or female, but we are restricting the topic of conversation today to the issues of black equality in America, in the American context. So we won't be addressing any issues relating to other parts of the world or even Malaysia. Thank you for your question regardless. I have a question from Dr. Lim Chui Ping.
Hi, Dr. Lee.
Dr. Lim, her last slide, the last slide on your presentation was what's to be done could be true of any society, including us in Asia. Considering the continuing history and the scale of racism in the US, I wonder if something more impactful or life-changing can be or ought to be done. The Black Lives Matter movement in its original seems to be one such strategy. What can be done?
Are we talking about in the context of America, right? Um, yes, Black Lives Matter is one of them, but uh, it's a movement that is not particularly with a leader. It's leaderless, so to speak. It's got a lot of local chapters, and I think this is deliberate in the organizers of Black Lives Matter because I guess they learned from the '60s that you can't just rely on figures, right? One person cannot possibly shoulder everything, and so what the Black Lives Matter organization is doing is that it's a bunch of local chapters and a local uh, 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 sort of local Black Lives Matter units that's geared to empower people from all in every region in the country. And I think that is a key takeaway that I think they should follow instead of relying on one person. But it's not just protesting, and protesting is one of them, obviously, but it's also a pressure group, right? That if you have more of these groups that come out, then people are going to start listening and they're going to ask questions. Hey, why? What's going on here, right? And so when these conversations happen, that's when things start to move. So I guess to answer Dr. Lim's question, it's this. I think these sort of localized organizations is key, I think, to enacting change in America.
Kid,
One that's
I
inclusive, actually. So, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, kid, I actually saw a video by Martin Luther King, and I think it was very apt because he mentioned that yes, slavery was supposed to have ended in 1865 in America, and the blacks were freed. Now he says blacks were freed then, but they were not given anything right after they became free. They were given no land, they were given nothing, and they were still, in all sense of the word, they were still subservient to their white owners. They still had to work. Now, contrast this with what happened to the Italians coming from Italy or the Irish after the potato famine in the mid 1900s. They came to America and they applied and they got land to develop. The black people, the African Americans, were not given that privilege or that right. That has perpetuated until today that they still cannot, they could not really improve their lot because they were not given that right start at the beginning when
Yeah,
slavery ended.
yeah.
What's your
So,
comment?
so it's a very very steep hill for them to climb after
Correct.
1865, and it's sort of like compounds. These issues compound basically, and so it's not to say that black people couldn't make it. Obviously, Obama and Oprah Winfrey, right, or LeBron James for that matter. But these are exceptions to the norm, so to speak. As the statistics have shown you, right, that um, white families own 13 times more than blacks. So yeah, this is how privilege works.
We have a question from one of our degree students,
Oh.
Tan Keng Kwan. He says, although there are already numerous exploitation and killings of blacks in America, but why did specifically the death of George Floyd give such an intensive reaction to the American society? People do not seem restricted by the pandemic that is going on now. Why George Floyd? What changed?
That's a good question, King One. I would say I would say social media has a lot to do with this. Uh, in a very very graphic way, right? Of showing how a black man was basically need as he basically begs for his life. Uh, is really distraught. I mean, this is nothing new, right? There have been videos of surveillance videos of police killing black people, but I think the sort of sheer visceral visual of how George Floyd was killed was basically the one that sort of set things, because things are already still simmering, right? I mean, like people have been screwed over for a long time, but now with social media and viral videos, um, I mean, the idea that is saying, "Please, officer, I can't breathe," really just, I think, this really sets people off because we're basically witnessing somebody killing someone. I think
Correct.
that's the key here.
Correct. And but strangely, Rodney King was beaten up by a group of white police officers in 1991, and it still did not lead to them anything really changing in America.
Well, I mean, so let's we forget, right? The movement for equality and the fight for civil rights is still ongoing. From the '60s until now, it actually didn't stop, right? But what we see here, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Rodney King, are just sort of blips that you see. That in the background has always been this struggle for it. It's just that people are now more informed, or as in some of my college kids, my students would say woke, so to speak. So things do change, uh, maybe very, very, very slowly, but they're fighting for it. So I wouldn't say that things didn't change, but I think more and more people are sort of like realizing this, and that's a good thing.
Okay, I've got a question for Matthew One. He's curious what would the response from right wing politicians and extremists if Trump loses?
Oof.
What would their response be in amending the legislations for to respond to racial inequality?
So I think the two questions, right? What would right wingers do if they lose the elections? And two is, will they enact laws? Well, number one, currently the Democrats have controlled the House, so they can't do anything right now. So if Trump loses, I actually really don't know how this is gonna play out. Or at the very least, perhaps we can predict that he would say things like, "I was cheated out of this," or that fake news contributed to my loss. But I think I'm perhaps optimistic to say that if he loses, there'll be people throwing up a fuss, whining about it. But at the end of it, that's it, right? I don't think I, I don't think that the militia people are gonna come out with guns and just start shooting people. I don't think that's gonna happen. So uh, I don't think they can do much right now. And even if they try to do right, you see the last two Supreme Court cases. Even the Supreme Court was more conservative leaning, basically struck down some of the laws that the Trump administration has tried to go back on. So I might be optimistic to say that it's not gonna happen.
Okay, there's a comment and a question from Adrian again. Does anyone think it's a little strange that this discussion is taking place without there being any American speakers? It seems among us. What's our right to speak? Not that anyone's right to express themselves should be denied. Well, we welcome anyone to speak up, even any American listeners here. Unfortunately, we don't have any, but it's their right to speak up. It's in the First Amendment.
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
No, there wasn't really a question. It's just saying
Oh,
that this whole
ah,
topic that we are discussing doesn't seem to have any American speakers,
ah,
natives.
yes. Well, I think well, of course, in the disclaimer, right? I don't claim to represent the experience of Black Americans, but so I'm merely basically giving uh, my professional opinion as a person who has studied in the United States and read up on race theories and critical race theories, and basically this is where it is. And I suppose because we're in Malaysia, right? It's a little bit more difficult to get American speakers here, so to speak.
Okay, with that, we're coming to an end of our session. This was a very interesting discourse by Dr. Lim Eu Kit. He's the
Thank you.
head of the Department of American and Canadian Education at Help University. We hope this session has benefited you. We hope to hear from you all if you have anything to say. My colleague will share the QR code for you to give us your feedback on this. Zani, if you please share the code now. I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to all the people tuning in today. Please give us your feedback. We'll be having more sessions coming up very soon, and we will inform you all in due course. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening.